Okay, let's see if this is working now. I'm having a little bit of trouble with audio here. I'm getting this warning message that the bit rate is low. So just if anyone is watching, let me know if the audio is working. So if anybody's there, just let me know if the audio is working. This is what it looks like over on my end here. Let's see, I got the YouTube studio set up. Got just a couple. Audio is working. Thank you. Hey, thank you so much. That's perfect. Let's get started then. Sorry, I'm a few minutes late today. Let's get things going. So, just a quick kind of recap. Over the last week, I graded your papers and I gave you kind of a midterm grade. That's a kind of a pass or fail, purely informational grade there. So the idea is I give you a S for satisfactory or U for unsatisfactory. Um, this is not a final grade, it's not in your record, it's information to you about your current standing in the class. So if you had that U there for unsatisfactory, it's probably just because there was some unsubmitted material, and I encourage you to send me an email um, and let me know if you're planning on submitting stuff or how we can kind of fix that to get you in better standing for the remainder of the class. I am actually a bit behind on my email, so if you send me an email already, I should answer later today. I apologize about that. But I really enjoyed reading your papers. I thought everyone did actually an amazing job with their papers. Really enjoyed them. Um, and moving forward, what do we have left? We have another quiz. We have quiz number 3, which I think is open now or is about to open. Quiz number 4, the final, and another paper. Then you're done. You're done the class at this really kind of breakneck pace. So hopefully this was useful to you this semester. I was going to keep an eye on the chat box as well. It looks good. So this week we're talking about Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, who are commonly viewed as the kind of the first existentialist philosophers. So we are talking about a period now that is the 19th century. So we've we've covered so much material so fast. We're already, in the 1800s. And we're going to be talking about two very different, but also similar in some interesting respects, thinkers. Soren Kierkegaard, Danish theologian and existentialist, 1813, 1855, and Fred Nietzsche, 1844, 1900. Now, it's often said that these are the kind of first existentialist philosophers. Existentialism is a term you might be familiar with. It is something that kind of percolated through pop culture in some ways. It's often associated with a French wave of existentialism that occurred, in the interwar period, by which I mean 1920, 1930, through World War II, and then in the 50s and 60s as it kind of infiltrated popular consciousness through these philosophers that had more of a public impact, these public intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, who not only wrote philosophy books, they also wrote plays and novels who that illustrated the themes of existentialist philosophy through their stories, through their narratives. Camus is probably most famous for writing The Myth of Sisyphus, which was an essay um, that talked a little bit about the human condition through the myth of Sisyphus, who had to push a boulder up a hill only to watch it fall back down every time at the end. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a play called No Exit about three people locked in a room together. So you might find that if you're interested in existentialism, you might find the kind of the French thinkers of the 40s and 50s more accessible. However, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are also really good philosophers to read in the sense that their prose style is often very engaging, but they can also be very dense and hard to read if you don't have a lot of context for understanding what they're reacting to, what they're talking about. Um, so Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and authors like Dostoevsky are really part of this kind of initial wave of existentialist philosophy. Now, what is existentialism? Part of it you have to understand is kind of a reaction to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment era was characterized by a kind of optimism about human progress, about a faith in rationality and science to decipher the mysteries of the world and give us the answers to more or less everything. And as with any idea, with any movement, you get a counter movement. In the 18th century, you had this idea of Romanticism, which was a counter movement to the rationality of the Enlightenment. Romanticism in art, literature, philosophy asserted the importance of emotion over cold reason. It approached the natural world as something transcendent, not something to be understood, picked apart, analyzed, labeled, but as something to be experienced on an almost spiritual level. That the idea that you should experience nature through an encyclopedia as you're labeling the plants and the flowers and you're understanding what they can be used for uh, is too rationalistic. Nature has its own internal meaning and its own intrinsic value outside of our understanding of it. Romanticism also was kind of really emphasized the importance of the individual's will. Each individual is a passionate, unique person who is not just a rational member of some larger collective. So Romanticism and existentialism definitely are kind of part of this kind of counter-enlightenment thing. The Romantic period, if we're going to think about it, we're going to talk about 1750 to 1850. Um, so we also have, I mean, a huge amount of social changes happening in this period. We have kind of a rapidly accelerating capitalism. The historian Eric Hobsbawm actually called this period the Age of Revolution, and he notes in the introduction to his book, The Age of Revolution, which talks more or less about this period, 17, for him it's 1750, 1850, where words like industry were coined, factory, right? All these kind of new social relations came into being through the development of capitalism in the Industrial Revolution. So, but Romanticism really was about nature over industry, emotion over reason, the individual over society, right? So often exemplified in paintings like Wander Above the Sea of Fog. This is kind of the romantic ideal right here, right? The lone romantic individual on top of a mountain gazing upon nature's creation. So Romanticism approaches reality and human experience through symbols, through nature, through the idea that there's kind of a ineffable, incommunicable spirit of the age. So if you're familiar, for example, with like Jung, right, Carl Jung, the psychology of Carl Jung, there's a lot of like symbolism and mythology here in the explanatory framework of Jung, and these are very kind of romantic ideas that if you really want to understand the human experience, you understand our place in nature, science is not going to actually give you anything worthwhile. It's going to give you a bunch of labels, but it's not going to help you understand who you are, what your purpose is, what drives you as an individual. So reality is kind of something you understand by reading myth and experiencing nature. Here's Williams Blake, The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed in Sun. So, and part of that, as I've said, is very much a reaction against the Enlightenment, against rationalism, against the Industrial Revolution. In part, also a reaction against the upending of society caused by capitalism, which, displaced agrarian lifestyles, displaced craftsmen, workmen, small-scale local production in the favor of mass production. As so, Fyodor Dostoevsky and Notes from Underground kind of puts this critique very succinctly. New economic relations will be established, right, the Industrial Revolution, so that all sorts of problems will vanish in a twinkling simply because ready-made solutions will be provided for all of them. Everything will be so splendidly rational, but here's the rub. Reason is only reason. It can only satisfy the reasoning ability of man, whereas volition, that is our will, is a manifestation of the whole of life. What does reason know? Reason only knows what it has succeeded in getting to know, whereas human nature acts as a whole, with everything that is in it, consciously, unconsciously, and thought, and though it may commit all sorts of absurdities, it persists. So human will, human experience, human nature is not just a splendidly rational creature creating scientific industrial solutions to its problems. We're so much more than that. Um, Romanticism and Kant. Let me just get to existentialism because I feel like I've been giving too much of a preamble here. Let me just also very quickly see if there's any comments. Oh, we're good. So Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, Danish thinker, himself ambivalent towards Romanticism, but it clearly deeply influenced his thought. He also had a focus on the individual, but he viewed the Romantics as a little too preoccupied with the aesthetics of things over a genuine engagement with reality. Aesthetics, of course, means kind of the style, the fashion, right? If you think of that painting from before, Wanderer over the Sea of Fog, right? So these guys in a dramatic overcoat with his walking stick looking down on the fog from the top of the mountain. That looks cool, and I'm sure the guy's convinced himself he's having some kind of genuine, authentic spiritual experience, but probably instead of painting, if somebody did that now, they'd just take a selfie, right? And and we feel there's something, the more you prioritize aesthetics, the less authentic you might be, because you're worried about how it looks, not how it is. And what Kierkegaard says is that, look, if you don't have a fundamentally ethical or religious concern, Romanticism is really some kind of self-serving quest to cure your boredom and to look cool, but not much more. And Kierkegaard also thought in terms of the Enlightenment scientific rationality, it's kind of sterile, it's too objective to really give a meaning to human life, because both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are really interested in saying something about our personal lives, our subjective lives, thinking there's maybe deeper truths that we can get there, that we can get from there. Um, so prior to this, philosophy, from Kant all the way back to Plato, was very much a system building enterprise in the sense that we're trying to build a fully self-contained picture of the world that encompassed ethics and metaphysics, epistemology, um, and kind of create a cohesive, coherent system that would just kind of hand to you answers about the nature of reality and our purpose in it. But these systems were, in their aspirations to be true and objective, were also very detached from human life. And we should think of existentialism as a very radically different kind of philosophy. It's not really a set of facts, it's not a system, it's not a doctrine, it's almost a mode of engagement with reality. Um, we can think of engaging with reality in different ways. We can view the world as a scientist, we can view it as a poet, as a parent, as a child, and we can also see things as existentialists, which is to relate reality to us just as subjective individuals. Um, Doing this, there's a number of mistakes we should avoid making. For example, our inner lives is not necessarily who we are. For the existentialist, we are who we pretend to be, so we have to be careful who we are pretending to be, because the sum total of our being are our actions, not our intentions, not how we even experience our actions. As Jean-Paul Sartre would later put it, our existence precedes essence, because we're radically free to do what we want in life. So internal thoughts don't matter as much as external actions in being. Um, so Kierkegaard's focus on the individual here makes him a really pivotal figure. Um, Let me just talk a little bit about him. So, I mean, I'm probably anticipating my slides a little bit, but Kierkegaard definitely critiqued the system building of prior philosophers as being something that you kind of create and then walk away from and not actually live. But Kierkegaard's guiding question says, what I really lack is to be clear in my mind what I am to do, not what I am to know. It's not about metaphysical knowledge, it's about what I'm supposed to do with my life. The thing is to understand myself, to see what God really wishes me to do. The thing is to find a truth which is true for me, to find the idea which I can live and die, for which I can live and die. What would be the use of discovering objective truth, of working through all the systems of philosophy, and of being able to review them all and showing up the inconsistencies within each system if it had no deeper significance for me and my life? So one of the issues with, especially Enlightenment era philosophy, is that it seemed to be extremely complex metaphysical systems which were very hard to apply, which you would just kind of know and believe and recite, and then you'd go about your daily life as if nothing had changed. Or as Kierkegaard put it, in relation to their systems, systematizers, that is philosophers, are like a man who builds an enormous castle and lives in a shack close by. They do not live in their own enormous building, but spiritually this is the decisive objection. Spiritually speaking, a man's thought must be the building in which he lives. So it's no good creating an extremely complicated system of philosophy, of ethics, of metaphysics, if you're just going to walk away from it and then just live life like everyone else does. Because then your system is not influencing your actual life. You're just using words. You're just stringing words together, but you're not acting any differently. A man's thought must be the building in which he lives. So Kierkegaard, as I said, is a theologian. He's very much concerned with the proper relationship to not just religion, but the very idea of Christianity, and thus your relationship to God, particularly with religious thought. Kierkegaard says there should be no theoretical attitude. You don't want a system, right? You don't want to be a man who's drowning reading a book about the theory of swimming. You just want to swim, right? What's existentially important is not the doctrines, the theoretical systems of philosophy or theology, except to the extent that these will tell you how to live your life. Theoretical approaches to God and theology dismiss the real question about your individual responsibility to its answer. Kierkegaard's probably his most famous idea that comes out that we still use and talk about is kind of the idea of a leap of faith. And the leap of faith is often misunderstood as the idea that ultimately your relationship to God requires some kind of non-rational leap of faith that you believe despite the evidence. This is not exactly right. The idea rather is that there's always going to be a gap between what you know and how you act. No series of objective facts, it's kind of a Humean point almost, right? You can't get an ought from an is. Right? No set of facts, no doctrines will actually motivate you to act in a specific way. You can know a bunch of things and then just kind of keep acting in any other way. Right? So there's a disconnect between, right, what you think and how you act. And to bridge that gap requires a leap of faith. Right? Thinking can turn towards itself in order to think about itself, and skepticism can emerge. But this thinking about itself never accomplishes anything. Being a Christian is not defined by the what, but the how. Right? So it's not what you believe, it's how you act. And there can always be a huge gap between what you think you believe and how you actually act. Faith is the objective uncertainty with the repulsion of the absurd, held fast in the passion of inwardness, the relation of inwardness intensified to the highest. This formula fits only the one who has faith. who relates himself to the absolute paradox. So the leap of faith is your resolution to the paradox of the gap between your thoughts and your actions. That no set of beliefs can actually motivate you to act according to them. You need to just take the leap of faith into acting that way, right? There's a sense in which no amount of evidence is possibly sufficient for a total commitment in your life. And the role of the leap of faith is to kind of mediate, to be a bridge between the distance between the commitment to change your life and how far just reason can get you. All right, again, this is kind of an Enlightenment critique, a critique of the Enlightenment, a critique of rationality as insufficient. Because more than reason is required. And one of the great obstacles to taking this leap of faith and actually acting according to your beliefs and not just acting in some other way is that we tend to, this some other way we act tends to be kind of superficial social conformity. You know, a utilitarian might believe that we should always do the greatest good for the greatest possible number. But how many self-professed utilitarians will actually act on this doctrine and give away substantial portions of their money to charity? Very few actually do, like a guy like Peter Singer might. You can look him up. So Kierkegaard's going to say that it makes it social conformity makes it difficult for the individual to discern what they believe in and to act in an authentic manner in relation to their beliefs. What does this mean? Like sometimes people will just repeat things they've heard that they don't really understand because they've heard it said by other people, which results in social approval, but not authenticity. That was very abstract. Let me try again. When I was a kid, um, when I was, just like 10, 12 years old, I would definitely kind of impress the adults around me by being able to insert sentences that I'd heard previously in the context that resulted in their approval. Now, I had no idea what I was saying, but I know that if I put those words together, the adults would go like, "Oh, yes, that's a good point, good point." So if you're 10, 12 years old, like me, you're growing up during the Cold War in the 80s, people would talk about the Soviet Union, which was still a thing. And I'd go like, well, it's a great idea, except it just goes against human nature. And the adults would go like, well, that's a good point. But did I have any idea what I was saying? Well, no, of course not. I'm 10 years old. I don't have a theory of human nature. I barely even knew what the Soviets were. I didn't know what communism was. But I've heard it said before. I knew it resulted in social approval, so I just repeated it. And then eventually, if you don't break out of this cycle, you craft a false identity as a result of the approval created by social conformity. This Kierkegaard calls the aesthetic mode of being. That it's just the easiest thing. You just conform to the values of the people around you, you seek their approval, and you craft your being solely on the basis of this. But you have to move out of it. You have to move from this to the ethical mode of being, of a consistent reflective morality, and ultimately, Kierkegaard says, to the highest mode, the religious mode. Right? Um, and Kierkegaard was I think he's a really prescient, very before his time author in terms of the dangers of the aesthetic mode of being. Because to be an authentic person is to give your life meaning in a process of becoming what you are. But there are lots of distractions. Right? He writes at the present age, and gosh, imagine if Kierkegaard saw social media. Oh my gosh, right? He says the 19th century is an age of mob anonymity, where the person who has no opinion in an event at the actual moment accepts the opinion of the majority, or if he's quarrelsome of the minority. Right? So there's right? So you have to have a hot take on things, and you can either go with the majority, or if you're a contrarian, go with the minority, and you call that a personality. But what you don't have, Kierkegaard will say, is an authentic relationship to who you are and your beliefs and your ethical system. And there's something to this, because there's a lot of evidence from psychology that people's beliefs can be a function of identity over truth. People don't engage with information, but as a marker of identity, and information becomes tribal. Right? In the United States right now, let me just check my chat box here. In some places, if you wear a face mask in public, that's a political act. Um, Even though there's a lot of information suggesting wearing a face mask during a pandemic is actually a really good idea. Um, but it just for some people they just view this as an identity marker. You can just Google like face mask politics America and you'll find tons of articles. Um, and it's really important for Kierkegaard that we move out of the aesthetic mode toward the ethical mode and finally towards the religious mode. Why is the religious mode so important to Kierkegaard? Well, in part because mere rationality and only rationality, right? Only like science and enlightenment and progress. At the end of the day, Kierkegaard said, it's going to threaten us with nihilism. Nihilism is the belief that there are no values. You can have knowledge and truth, but you don't have value. You don't have morality. You don't have ethics. Because he says, look, if a human being did not have an eternal consciousness, if underlying everything there was only a wild, fermenting power that, writhing in dark passions, produced everything, significant, insignificant, if a vast, never appeased emptiness is beneath everything, what would life be then but despair? But Kierkegaard, of course, being rhetorical, there's more, there's not just despair. Underneath it is the fact that for him, the belief that human beings do have an eternal consciousness, that God exists, that God sent his only begotten Son to die for our sins, etc. All the Christian theology that you can't just accept as a system and go off and live your life. You have to let it radically reconfigure your mode of being, your mode of acting in the world. Otherwise, you're merely living in the aesthetic mode, or worse, you're going to succumb to nihilism. Right? If a human being did not have eternal consciousness, if death was annihilation, if there's no meaning, if we're just living randomly in a dark universe where life is an accident, where nothing has purpose, life would be just despair. Is this right? Nietzsche, who we now turn to, answers this rhetorical question very differently. He's going to say, it doesn't matter if we despair because this is our life. It's all we have. Nietzsche was probably the harshest critic of Christianity to ever write in the Western tradition. And of course, he did believe a human being does not have eternal consciousness. He did believe underlying everything there's only a fermenting power and writhing in dark passions. Nietzsche is the atheist to Kierkegaard's theism. And nevertheless, they're very similar in the sense that they're both struggling with the same problems. They're both reacting to rationalism, to science, to the Enlightenment. They want to recapture what it means to be an individual, but they come from very different perspectives. Kierkegaard, the theist, ultimately grounds life in the religious mode of being. Nietzsche, the atheist, is going to have to ground the meaning of life in a different way. What did I just do? So, similarities, right? Nietzsche, 1844, 1900, also concerned with the individual, right? For the subjective perspective of the individual, their experience, their lives. What is it to be authentic, right? Did not trust metaphysical system building. Also wrote about God, the meaning of life, the threat of nihilism, right? The crucial difference. Kierkegaard, sincere Christian theist. Nietzsche, straight atheist. Thunderous critique of Christianity. So Nietzsche now is not much of a pop culture figure the way sometimes philosophers can become. You know, if you watch Bill and Ted's, there's this 80s movie, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I think they meet Socrates and Plato. I haven't seen that in years. Nietzsche shows up in pop culture. I think if you watch Little Miss Sunshine, there's a character who's reading a lot of Nietzsche. Little Miss Sunshine, it's an okay movie. So Nietzsche is kind of best known for proclaiming that God is dead. So if you listen to Nine Inch Nails, right, there's that song on the Downward Spiral. I think it's called Heresy, where Trent Reznor's like, God is dead. But the full quote, and I think it's really important that when it comes to Nietzsche's atheism and how he relates to that and how we should live our lives, that we actually look at the full context of the quote. Because when he proclaims that God is dead, what he's really saying is that religion is no longer believable. Um, and as a result, we need to think about the ramifications of this loss of belief. So Nietzsche says God is dead. God remains dead. We have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? All right, so Nietzsche always writes like this. The prose is always really like a super overwrought. Like this guy's volume knob's always on 10. Um, but what he's really asking here is, so he doesn't take atheism lightly. When Nietzsche says, look, we've killed God, then by which he means we've rendered the idea of God no longer really believable. And we've done this by, progressing so much as a species. We have all this science now. We know like the earth isn't the center of the universe. Everything we used to use God to explain and mythology to explain, science can explain. But if God is no longer believable, what are we going to do next? And because Nietzsche gives the idea of God its due, in the sense that he calls it the holiest and mightiest of all the world as yet owned, thinking the idea of theology, the idea of theism, the idea of God was probably the greatest idea humans had come up with up to that point. It accomplished so much for us. It ordered our societies. It gave us meaning and purpose. It helped us deal with the fact of our own deaths. It helped us grieve. It helped us understand why we must bury our own children. And now we've killed this idea. Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves become gods to appear worthy of it? How can we move forward after killing God? I mean, it's 2020 now, and we've had a solid 50 years of like fairly casual atheism in society, and things haven't collapsed. But you got to put yourself in the context of Nietzsche writing in the kind of like 1860, 1875 period, where a large-scale collapse in religious belief seemed to be a portent of things to come. So Nietzsche's primary task, how long have I been talking? It's 39 minutes. So Nietzsche's task really is to kind of work out existentialism, that is kind of a philosophy that relates your being, like being as such, like who you are, your subjectivity, your relationship to the world, in the context of this atheism, what it means to be human in a universe without kind of an intrinsic meaning, without a God to ground existence in something higher, truer, objective, eternal, conscious, personal, ethical. As with Kierkegaard, right, Nietzsche admits there's a threat of nihilism here, right? Nihilism, right, the idea that nothing has value, is not only the belief that everything deserves to perish, one actually puts one's shoulder to the plow, one destroys. And Nietzsche warns us we need to become worthy of the death of God, or nihilism will come. So I have problems with some of his kind of the prophetic Nietzsche interpretation, right? So So when Nietzsche writes, for when truth enters into battle with the lies of millennia, we shall have convulsions, a spasm of earthquakes, a displacing of mountain and valley, the like of which we have never dreamed. The concept of politics will then be completely taken up with spiritual warfare. All the power structures of the old society will be blown sky high, for they all rest on lies. There will be wars like never before seen on earth. Um, and so the idea was that if we don't adequately address the death of God in society, the resulting social changes will cause wars like never before seen on earth. Now, some people have read World War I and World War II back into Nietzsche's warnings about post-atheistic nihilism. I don't think that's exactly right. Um, if you look at human history, even just European history, in the time, the 1,000 years before Nietzsche, you had awful religious war. You had planned famine, mass starvation. You had genocide and ethnic cleansing. Um, the only novel thing the 20th century offered was better weapons. So I'd be careful about reading something new into the death of God, something in the 20th century that had never happened in human history prior to it as a result. I just don't see it. The more I learn about history, the more I see these consistent themes of human barbarity, um, and also of human beauty and truth and progress. Um, but was there anything post anything post Enlightenment, anything intrinsic to this kind of the casual atheism of the 20th century that necessarily led to the world wars? I don't see it. Um, However, Nietzsche is right to warn us about one thing, right? The most cultural inimical sickness and unreasonableness that there is nationalism. Does anyone besides me know a way out of this blind alley? So, one thing Nietzsche is warning us about is that as we seek to replace the old theological underpinning of society, we should be careful not to replace it with ethnic nationalism, because it is a blind alley, it is a sickness, it is unreasonableness. Um, I think it's really important to remember this. If you know a little bit about Nietzsche, you might have heard that, he was a forerunner to Nazism or fascism, and I think that is partially due to the fact that his sister edited his works after his death, because uh, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche was kind of a German proto-fascist and anti-Semite, um, who deliberately presented his work to kind of like appeal to a certain kind of far-right German nationalism, um, thus suppressing. We only found this out later when we had access to the original Nietzsche archives after World War II, that Nietzsche despised nationalism and despised anti-Semitism. And there's nothing more anti-Nietzschean than to believe in this kind of like in nationalism, which is a fundamentally collectivist notion, whereas Nietzsche is so focused on the individual. But that's just me editorializing a little bit. I don't know if people have a lot of background knowledge about how Nietzsche was misused um, in the context of the world wars. Um, Nevertheless, let me just kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about why the idea of nihilism seemed like such a threat in the 19th century. Because in part you have to understand that scientific progress was not just like a light bulb and a telephone. It was also really reconfiguring our understanding of the age of the universe, its size, and our place in it. Um, the idea of geological time, that is, that the Earth is not a few thousand years old, not a few tens of thousands of years old, but millions and now billions of years old, is a modern idea. It's something we come up with around the time Nietzsche was writing, as a matter of fact. So around Darwin's time, right, we have the theory of evolution, which suggests that, all species are descended from common ancestry, right? So we are not special aspects of God's creation. We're just other animals that have evolved. That the Earth is very, very old. It wasn't created for any specific purpose. It's not at the center of the universe. We're just part of one galaxy. Um, it has existed for billions of years before humans and will continue to exist for billions of years after humans are gone. So in this perspective, right, and we think of the universe as this really big place, of which we are just a vanishingly small fraction of. And as big as it is in space, this is dwarfed by the abyss of time yawning before us. Right? That eventually, right, all the stars are going to run out of fuel. Every sun in every galaxy in every corner of the universe is eventually going to go black. And even the black holes themselves will evaporate to nothingness. Where's my, is this the one I'm thinking of? So if you look at, right, now Nietzsche didn't know this specifically, but we were starting to get an inkling of it. Right, so this is the Earth. Can I zoom in here? So if you think about this little planet, which very few of us have managed to leave, and of course on Nietzsche's time, this is all located in, of course, our solar system. And the solar system of ours is part of a kind of a solar interstellar neighborhood, they call it, which is, all the stars kind of close to us, right? The closest one is what, 4 or 5 light years away? It means you're traveling at the speed of light, it takes 5 years to get there. Our solar interstellar neighborhood is like 1 pixel. So all the stars you just saw, just a couple pixels of the Milky Way galaxy, which has hundreds of millions of stars, hundreds of millions, possibly billion planets. But we're not done yet. What is the relationship of our galaxy? Well, we're part of a local galactic group. Here's the Milky Way galaxy, and here's just a group of galaxies. It's our local galactic group. Andromeda galaxy, just huge. Triangulum galaxy. So these are all galaxies themselves, hundreds of millions of stars, billions of planets. And of course, our local galactic group here is part of the Virgo supercluster of galaxies. So all those galaxies you saw, it's the local galactic group right over here, which is part of the Virgo supercluster of galaxies. So all these little dots here, these aren't galaxies, these are collections of galaxies. Part itself of a local supercluster of galaxies, right, which is a collection of galaxies, right? So these couple pixels here, Virgo supercluster. Right, so we're at the local galactic group. You can't even see the Milky Way anymore, right? We're somewhere in, which is itself part of a supercluster, which is itself just a couple pixels in the observable universe. Now, I don't mean to inspire existential terror by showing you our local place in the universe. But for Nietzsche, the threat of nihilism and the death of God has to be kind of understood in the context of this slow realization of the human species, by the human species, of its relative place in nature, which is small, not particularly special, in fact, not special at all. And the times in which we exist, compared to the time before the species existed and the time after the species will exist, is vanishingly small, just as small in time as our planet is small in space. So what are we to do? Right? As Nietzsche himself put it, in some remote corner of the universe, poured out, glittering in innumerable solar systems, there once was a star by which clever animals invented knowledge. This was the highest and most mendacious minute of world history, but yet only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star grew cold and the clever animals had to die. Right? Again, in this story of humanity, the story that our science and our rationality seems to be telling us has to be true, we're not created for a purpose. There's nothing eternal. Our sun's going to run out of fuel, and probably long before that, our species will go extinct. And there'll have been no grand overarching purpose to it. And as Kierkegaard said, does that not make one feel hopeless? Is that not a despair, fundamentally? Nietzsche says, no, it's not a theory of despair. This is a theory of freedom. Nietzsche doesn't see nihilism as a necessary kind of conclusion of the realization that the human species is nihilistic despair. Kierkegaard saying, if there was no eternal consciousness, what is there but despair, is just straight up a contradiction. Nihilism is the view that nothing has value, and despair is itself a value judgment. It's an inconsistency on the part of the nihilists to despair at it, because their despair implies a value judgment that they are no longer able to place, because nihilism claims there are no values. In other words, if you're worried about becoming a nihilist, you're not actually a nihilist. You have values. And the question is, therefore, how are we going to live our values? Right? Nothing follows from nihilism to despair at the fact that there's no value, because that's a value judgment itself. He says, a nihilism is the man who judges the world as it is that it ought not to be, and of the world as it ought to be that it does not exist. You judge of the world as it is that it ought not to be, that there's something fundamentally wrong with the world as it is. This is part of his critique of Christianity, incidentally, that Christianity focuses too much on the afterlife and thus condemns life. That the problem of Christianity is that it somehow condemns the world through original sin, through its focus on a perfect afterlife, thus saying that life as it is must be imperfect, is sinful. But it can't be. This is what we have. This is all we get. You can't condemn all we get. That's fundamentally an anti-life point of view, Nietzsche says. So what we need is a new way forward. And what Nietzsche says is that the kind of open space that the death of God creates by getting rid of the old values is a cause for joy, because it means we are really free, which is this kind of idea of the atheist existentialist, from Nietzsche through the French, right, Jean-Paul Sartre atheist, Camus atheist, Simone de Beauvoir, right, atheist. They're all going to focus on the potential for human freedom that comes out of the death of God. And Nietzsche begins by saying, look, what is freedom? It means you have the will to assume responsibility for yourself. And what you're responsible for is your own values and your own morality. What you have to have is a personal revaluation of values in the form of a conscious decision to choose your values and hold yourself to them, because that's what freedom is. So one of the problems with religion, Nietzsche writes, is that they view morality and happiness in terms of a certain kind of formula. If you do this, if you refrain from doing that, the consequence is that you're going to be happy. Otherwise, you'll get punished. But Nietzsche says, really, my revaluation of values, that Nietzsche says, here's how I think of it. I think virtue is the effect of happiness. Virtue is the outcome of being in the right state, not its result. What does this mean? It means, well, think about how much easier it is to do the right thing when you kind of feel good already, right? So I get hangry. Like if I don't have lunch, I get straight hangry. Hangry, hunger plus anger, hangry. And it's so much harder for me to be patient with people, to be polite to my kid when they're, being kids. But if I feel good, it's easier to be good. And to feel good, well, you shouldn't deny your instincts, Nietzsche says. You should master your instincts, but don't deny them. There's nothing wrong with needing to have a snack and stop. There's nothing wrong with taking care of yourself. There's nothing wrong with pursuing the things that make you happy. Again, you have to put yourself in the context of the 19th century, where there was a great deal of repression of instincts. This is not a time where it was easy, for example, to be gay or lesbian, and that you're supposed to repress this. And if you did that and you refrained from this, you'd be happy, but it just wasn't true. So for Nietzsche, when you reevaluate your values, part of it is not denying your instincts, but mastering them. And this is kind of crucial to Nietzsche's attack on nihilism. The idea that we want things and it's okay to want things. That his attack on religion and the old order that kept nihilism at bay did so by restraining passion in the name of some higher ideal, but now the higher ideal is gone. So instead, we need to focus back on the will to power and our passions because it represents a fundamental psychological drive, Nietzsche thinks. It's normal to want to master something, to become good at things. It's normal to have ambition. It's normal to want to control your life and its circumstances. And when Nietzsche talks about the will to power, sometimes people kind of twist it to mean physical coercion, sometimes war in the literal sense of violence. But what he means is that it's normal to want to struggle for some personal objective. As he wrote in a notebook, unpublished, I have found strength when one does not look for it, in pleasant people without the least desire to rule. And the desire to rule can be often a sign of weakness. Right? They become the slaves of their followers and their fame, etc. Right? So the drive to control your life and circumstances is not necessarily a drive to authority and hierarchy. It could actually be quite the contrary. The right kind of I've been talking for way too long. It's like 58 minutes. I need to wrap things up. So the right kind of mastered morality, right? Somebody who's reevaluated their own values, who has mastered their instincts, is comfortable with the expression of their will to power and does not seek to diminish it. In the foreground, Nietzsche says, there's a feeling of fullness, of power that seeks to overflow, the happiness of high tension, the consciousness of wealth that would give and bestow. The noble human being helps the unfortunate, but not from pity, but prompted more by an urge begotten by excessive power. The noble human being honors himself as one who is powerful, as one who has power over himself, who delights in being severe with himself, and thus respects all severity and hardness. Right? It's really crucial that you're hard on yourself, way before you're hard on other people. And the consequence of this hardness is a consequent generosity of spirit, a love of life, and this feeling of abundance and joy. So, right, I mean, crucially here, right, I think, again, crucially, right, the noble human being helps not from pity, but an urge begotten by excessive power. So Nietzsche does not like the emotion of pity, and he finds the old religious order full of pitying the poor. We should not act out of, nobody wants to be pitied, right? It's an awful thing if somebody looks at you like with pity. Right? Whether when you give, it should be from an urge begotten by a sense of excessive power that you have so much that you can just kind of like, here, take this. I have so much, it's fine. I'm not even going to miss it. All right? That is the way you want to create nobility. Right? So, I mean, think in terms of the politics of this, right? So, if you believe in a certain amount of redistribution of wealth in society through, I don't know, universal health care, are you giving people universal health care because you pity the poor, or because I think that's actually kind of an awful reason for doing it, right? But if you have an urge begotten by the sense of excessive power, that you have so much that you just feel like you just need to give, right? Because you've mastered yourself and you have this sense of power that we're, as a society, politically, we're so rich and we have so much that we could just give, not out of pity, but out of the nobility of this, right? I mean, there's a whole ethic here, which is actually really interesting to work out. Gosh, master morality. You can read about slave morality, is aristocratic. Let me just close with one more idea of Nietzsche's, because I think there's a really rich vein of philosophy to mine here in terms of his suggestions for how to live authentically given the death of God, in terms of like mastering your will, not denying your instincts, reevaluating the values around you, which just means kind of like looking at the values of the society around you and deciding whether they are in fact your values. All right, again, very Kierkegaardian idea. You don't want to fall into the aesthetic mode of being. But ultimately, and this is one of kind of Nietzsche's kind of crucial key insights about morality, he says, look, If you're not sure whether you're living your life well, ask yourself this question, um, and reflect on the answer, right? What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you in your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life, as you now live it, as you have lived it, you're going to have to repeat and live once more, and innumerable times no more. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, but I have never heard anything more divine. My formula for human greatness is amor fati, that one wants to have nothing different, not forward, not backwards, not in all eternity, not merely to bear the necessary, still less to conceal it, but to love it. So what is Nietzsche saying here, right? He's saying, look, imagine there was an afterlife and there's no heaven or hell. Instead, every decision you've made, every experience, every moment of your life, you're going to repeat it, and you're just going to experience that forever. You're just going to relive your life exactly as it was forever. Would you think this is hell? Would you think it's heaven? Would you be okay? Would you look back and cringe and go like, "Oh God, I can't believe I have to do this again"? And if you answer to this question, "Oh gosh, I can't imagine having to relive all of my decisions again," then you got to rethink those decisions, right? How should you live your life? Nietzsche's not going to give you a morality or an ethics. He's not going to say thou shalt. He's going to say you should live your life as if you were condemned to repeat it forever. Live your life as if you were condemned to repeat that life forever. And if you make a decision that you look back and say, and if you had to watch yourself make that decision infinitely many times, and that seems like torture to you, you need to change the decisions you're making. Live your life as if you're condemned to repeat it forever is the ultimate guide for Nietzsche in terms of his overcoming atheistic nihilism. This is all what are you going to do with your freedom? This is all you're going to get in a giant universe. Live your life as if you're condemned to repeat it forever. Anyway, I have some more Nietzsche quotes here. You can read them. You can read the chapter. If you're interested in reading more about Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, either or is a great starting point for Kierkegaard. Fear and Trembling, I think, as well. For Nietzsche, where's a good Nietzsche starting point? Probably The Collected. Do I have yeah. So I'd probably recommend The Portable Nietzsche, edited by Walter Kaufmann. You can get this at a bookstore. And it is a series of uh, excerpts from his work from various books of his. So these are the things I'd recommend if you're interested in these philosophers. All right. Thanks for watching. I'm going to have another live stream on Thursday, of course. And hope I didn't go on too long. It's just one of my favorite weeks. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. All right. Thanks so much.